Welcome to Media Empires, where we sit down with the most influential media creators right now to learn exactly how they built their empires. Our aim is to extract the secrets of top-tier podcasters, newsletter authors, and media creators who are breaking the old rules for media success. Whether you're looking to start your own empire or simply curious about the nuts and bolts behind media businesses, you'll find valuable insights and tactics in each episode. Grab your headphones, let's dive in.
This week on Media Empires, I sit down with Craig Fuller, founder and CEO of FreightWaves, which began as a combination media company and data provider for the logistics industry. In this conversation, we cover the evolution of FreightWaves, discuss different media models and their scalability, and what he thinks the future of AI media will look like.
Craig, welcome to Media Empires. Thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Really glad to be here.
So Craig, you're pioneering with FreightWaves, one of the first or earliest or most successful kind of media and data combination businesses, media plus SaaS data businesses. Why don't you talk about how that came to be? Because that wasn't sort of the original plan, right? How did you come to build sort of this combination media data business? And then we'll talk about why that's so underrated and how more people should be thinking about doing that.
So Erik, I don't know if this is ironic, but we announced today that we've split the businesses up. So
wow, amazing.
So really this morning, as this is being recorded, we did an announcement that we have actually divested our media business from our SaaS business. So now you have two entities. You have the data business and the media business. And that may sound like, I had somebody ask me this morning if that was if my thesis about being able to incubate a SaaS business with a media business was incorrect. I said, no, I think it's actually quite the opposite, is that we have been able to scale a SaaS business and a media business of sufficient scale that now we have the opportunity to spin off two separate companies and have an enormous amount of value in both of those entities.
Yeah. Well, we'll get to the split in a bit. Why don't you tell the story of how it came to be in the first place?
Yeah, so FreightWaves has been around since 2016. Really went commercial. Sort of the first part of our business went commercial in 2017, which is our media business. We launched it in first quarter of 2017. And then we launched a data product in 2018. It would have been May of 2018 we first announced it, but went commercial in that one in August. And really the idea is modeled after Bloomberg's business model of taking a media business and providing top of funnel for a data business is really what we pursued. And what Bloomberg aspires to do, or what Bloomberg does, I should say, in the financial side of the economy, we aspire to do in the physical goods side of the economy, which is providing information, intelligence about the global supply chain and using data to inform it.
Yeah. And say more about the media business exactly. What are the different product lines within the media business, and how has that grown?
Yeah, so in the media business, really media businesses make money through a couple of different ways, and our media business is not different. It's ultimately you either make money in media really through subscriptions, you make money in advertising, or you make money in events or commerce. And so those are sort of the four sort of legs of the stool, if you will, in terms of media monetization. FreightWaves Media, which is really freightwaves.com. We have a number of podcasts that we do, some streaming TV, is predominantly advertising funded. So essentially what that means is that we're taking in advertising services. Companies are paying us to reach their audiences. And essentially our media business is providing, helping them provide either brand awareness or top of funnel. And we use that money that we collect through advertising to essentially continue to build out the media business. And that's really how we made money. As a byproduct of that, of having this large audience, we also realized that our audience wants data. So we went out and created a data product that enables participants in the market to know what's happening in the global supply chain, to be informed of that. And that was really how we incubated our data product.
Yeah, that's a great overview. And you mentioned four business models there. How do you advise media companies like the ones listening in to pick, or how did you pick or land on advertising is the best for you? And what criteria do you recommend entrepreneurs think about when think about which business model to pick, whether it's commerce, events, advertising, or subscription?
Yeah, look, I think all of them. I don't think there's any. The reality of media businesses is that these are really hard businesses. They're fickle. content itself and news stories are largely outside of your control, because particularly if you're doing news, and most media businesses at its foundation have some level of news. I mean, you have entertainment, which is an entirely different vehicle, which I know very little about. We call it almost fiction in some ways. But when it relates to sort of media businesses in terms of news, is effectively what you're doing is, a lot of what drives the success of a media business, or traffic, if you will, is driven by external events. You have no control over a company filing bankruptcy, or a company going public, or some new regulatory construct. And so largely you've built this business to provide information and context about what's happening. So advertising becomes a really the best way to sort of function that. You could also have a subscription product that is essentially your readers are providing subscription revenue. But again, it is also fickle. It's driven by sort of the media climate. I mean, there's a lot of conversations in media circles about the Trump bump, if you will, is that Trump was such a polarizing figure. People loved him or hated him, but that's great for media businesses, because if you have an audience that hates Donald Trump, they're subscribing to read content that sort of reinforces their hatred of Donald Trump. And you have an audience that loves Donald Trump, and they're reading content that sort of reinforces their love for Donald Trump. Regardless, there's a great way to drive subscriptions. And unfortunately, Biden doesn't have that level of polarization that Donald Trump did. And frankly, very few politicians do. I know a lot of people who loathe Biden because they don't, they sort of wonder, whether he's the right guy based on his age. But I don't know an enormous amount of people who really love Biden, who would subscribe to content specifically because of Joe Biden. They may love the movement that he stands for in some of his positions, but he is a pretty quiet politician, and isn't very visible in public, and therefore isn't driving a lot of media subscriptions. Whereas Donald Trump, regardless of where you stand, and I think that's really what happens in the news business, is that you end up you're generating revenue through advertising, you're generating through subscriptions. It tends to be very sort of driven by these external events that we have very little control over. When you get into other types of media properties, which include like physical events, as you're putting on an event, you really you have a larger degree of control of the outcome there. It's who you develop for speakers, it's who do you develop for content, it's how do you program those events, how do you market those events. It's building the right sort of balance between some level of entertainment and networking with, you want to get the right people in the room, and you get the right people in the room, people show up. And that's really sort of the model for events. And commerce, it's also largely in your control. You're taking your audience and finding some other products or services that you can sell that audience that they want. And one of the things that's great about media businesses is really two things. One is there's a commonality in a media business. People are reading your content for a reason, because they care about the topic that you're covering. Therefore, you can sell them products and services that are built on that sort of product that you're covering. And so that's sort of one element of it. And the other is that you have a lot of influence over people, how people think about a topic or a product. And in doing so, there's a great way to commercialize it. I think you have to be careful how much you sort of, you want to make sure that you maintain a level of integrity in your editorial product. But I do think there's a really nice balance of being able to influence the way people think about a topic or a product, and then also be able to offer those products.
Yeah, that's well said. And so you mentioned the majority of your revenue comes from advertisers relative to those business models. Say more about the formats that you've picked that serve your audience the best.
So in terms of when you
like
say
a podcast, newsletter, who is your audience that the advertiser is paying a premium to reach, and how do you best reach your audience?
Yeah, for FreightWaves, I mean, ultimately it's decision makers that are involved in the logistics and supply chain industry. This is a massively large industry. It's 12% of global GDP. It is 8 million people work in the logistics industry in the United States. So it's a enormously large business. There's, 1 million plus companies that are involved in some element of supply chain, whether they're running their own supply chain, whether they're in the retail or warehousing or manufacturing, or they're in the logistics business or warehousing business. There's a lot of decision makers. Ultimately, we are creating product. In our world, product is a media product. So a newsletter could be a product, or a podcast could be a product. We're creating product and inventory that effectively we can sell advertisers that reach specific audiences. So in the case of a newsletter, it's a topic that is perhaps people care about. So let's take in supply chain, people are really intrigued with sort of this nearshoring or sort of deglobalization that's taking place and a reconfiguration of the globe. Well, we have a newsletter tied specifically to that topic where it's sort of de-emphasizing it's sort of a nearshoring sort of topic. And so anyone that's involved in sort of being impacted by nearshoring, whether you're involved in global sourcing and you historically source things out of China, or you're involved in real estate development and industrial and manufacturing, you care deeply about what's happening around nearshoring. So that's the audience that have sort of commonality. And we would develop a newsletter, potentially a podcast. I mean, you want it to be omni-channel. So one of the things that we've tried to do is take, I think there's a lot of media companies, the successful ones will do one thing really well, and then some things okay. It's hard to sort of be a newsletter company and a podcast company and a digital website company at the same time, if you're trying to serve very large, sort of these macro audiences, because you just have a finite number of resources that can sort of dive into these topics. And you do see there are certainly examples of that. The New York Times is a great example that's been incredibly successful doing it. Large scale media platforms do it, but in niche media, it's actually more challenging, because to build a platform for successful podcasts and newsletters, it can be challenging because you just how to execute that. But one of the things we found that works really well for us is to essentially what we create communities, which is let's take this nearshoring topic that we say, hey, this is a really important topic, people are really interested in it, and we create newsletters in addition to podcasts, in addition to video, and try to build a whole community around it. It may not be a massive audience, and I think this is the reason that a lot of companies struggle with it, is they look at their sort of macro audiences and maybe they have 1 million or 10 million people. These very topical audiences are going to be much smaller than that, maybe a couple thousand. And so it's just building resources into it. It's hard to monetize in some ways smaller audiences unless you are doing direct sales. And one of the reasons I think a lot of the big companies have struggled with this is a lot of their advertising, digital advertising, is programmatic. And programmatic works really well on large numbers. It works really poorly when you're reaching micro-targeted groups. We don't do any programmatic advertising. Everything is direct sold. So from our standpoint, the big numbers are less important than hitting the right audiences.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsor. Hey, everybody. If you don't already subscribe to the Media Empires newsletter, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power this and other Turpentine newsletters is called Beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business. And they built Beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails, from essayists to business owners. The platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. Beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The Beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, Newsletter Operator, and so many more. Beehiiv's founder hooked up Media Empires listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code EMPIRES. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I understand of your big insight was that building a media company alongside a SaaS company allows you to, instead of spend a ton of money on marketing, trying to rent an audience, allows you to own an audience that then makes the CAC decrease over time and even be negative. for your business. Is that right? Is that the best combination of how or the best encapsulation of how these businesses are strategic to each other, synergistic?
Yeah, we have something called negative CAC, which is essentially, if you think about SaaS businesses, is, and this is true of any SaaS business of scale, is like 50% of your cost is in customer acquisition, and retention is a portion of that. But essentially, you are spending an enormous amount of money acquiring new customers, and so one of the big challenges is how do you do that efficiently? And a lot of SaaS companies, what they do is they naturally go and get a Google account, an AdWords account, and a LinkedIn account, and they start driving, spending an enormous amount of money, effectively renting an audience, and in doing so, they're able to scale their business and scale their SaaS business. The challenge of doing that is the moment you cut off your spend and you stop renting that audience, you lose a lot of your inbound. And so most companies start out that way. It's really about from what I understand, talking to private equity group, it's really $50 to $100 million in ARR before you see companies get really good at sort of content marketing and sort of developing their audiences. We did the opposite. We actually didn't start out by buying leads. We built a media business to provide context and intelligence on global supply chains. And as a byproduct of doing so, we happened to build a very successful media operation that we were able to sell advertising to, and it became its own business and still serve the core SaaS business. And so the biggest issue that we've had, frankly, is that our media business became too successful because it started to become a big issue for us in the sense that we have this very successful media business and this very successful SaaS business, and investors, everything about building a SaaS business and any technology business is, when you're consuming capital, you're always sort of trying to figure out, how do I create the most value for this? And valuation is always set by the next set of investors or the next set of buyers. So, our SaaS business is about a $30 million revenue business. You think about what the next stage is, it's naturally private equity, probably could be a strategic, but more likely PE. And they're going to set the tone. Well, they like very clean businesses that they can sort of model and understand against other businesses. So one of the things we found is that our media business was just too big of a piece of the revenue that it actually made sense to spin it off. And so now we split the two businesses. It's not that we have, in any ways, that thesis of having negative CAC doesn't work. It's that actually we were really successful at doing it. And we reached a point where the SaaS business doesn't need the media business to be a self-sustaining entity.
And so what does that mean in terms of, do most of the investors stay with the SaaS business and the media business?
All of the investors stay with the SaaS business. I purchased the media business myself.
Cool. Because the media business is self-sustaining and
right. And I merged it into another media business I own.
Flying Mag.
So Flying Media Group was previously known as Fire Media Group. Today we now call Firecrown as the new entity, but it basically, in that media business, it's the largest publisher in aviation, it's the largest publisher in marine, and now we're the largest publisher in supply chain. And so it's effectively took that, the 60 some odd people that work inside the FreightWaves media business and merged them into this broader media platform that I have.
Yeah. And you've also said that you think, partially for the reasons of negative CAC, but for other reasons too, that media businesses are just greatly underrated. Investors don't understand them. Flesh out more about why they're underrated, why they're so powerful, and if everyone believed what you believe, would there be a lot more FreightWaves, a lot more, just industry specific, or say more about this just phenomenon of how to think about media businesses today?
Yeah, I mean, I think media businesses 10 years ago were really hot venture. There was an enormous amount of venture capital going into media businesses, largely consumer. So just keep that in mind, is, Vice and BuzzFeed and all these big consumer platforms. You could even argue The Athletic. A lot of these media businesses raised an enormous amount of venture capital. Cheddar. We can name all these companies that raised an enormous amount of venture capital. And what ended up happening is that they never really achieved the goals that the VCs had wanted. And VCs are looking for 100x returns in businesses. Like, at the end of the day, media businesses are incredibly difficult to achieve those kind of venture scale valuations. They just aren't going to just not going to get there. And so the challenge is that you can't build it's very difficult to build a multi-billion-dollar media business. And the ones that have ever sort of achieved that level of scale have largely, if they're sort of venture backed, have largely gone away. You ultimately are trading, media businesses trade at a function of EBITDA or a multiple of EBITDA. And venture backed businesses are not built to be EBITDA businesses. They're built to be high growth, um, revenue multiple businesses that don't generate positive cash flow in EBITDA. And so when you end up in a situation where your businesses, the types of industries that you're in, are not able to trade at venture like multiples, it just means that the investor base is not interested in putting a lot of money into it. Like, these are great businesses for founders because you can bootstrap them and you can make money. But you're unlikely to achieve a 9-figure outcome in any of these businesses, in these media businesses, without some kind of M&A strategy behind it. Because at some point, media, as big as you can get, you can cover a topic incredibly well. There's a ceiling on how big that media business can get. This is the reason VC funds don't like it, is there is a theoretical ceiling in a media business. There's only a finite number of subscribers or advertisers that want to reach an audience in that vertical. Supply chain is a massively big vertical, and we've built a large media business to it. Probably 75 to 80% of the traffic associated with supply chain goes through our site, but it's a small business relative to other media businesses. And so in order to grow FreightWaves Media, we've got to find other topics and other types of issues and context to go out and address. And so the challenge is that, like, at the end of the day, this is a very different opportunity than a technology business, which, effectively, you think about technology businesses. If what I'm ultimately trying to do is I look at the total size of the universe, the total number of participants in a market. And ideally, if my product has product market fit, I should be able to sell an instance or a subscription to every single one of the participants in that market of sort of the same size. Media businesses don't work that way. There's a finite number of advertisers. There's a finite audience to it. So the data business and SaaS business works really well for subscriptions, software investors, which is really venture. It works really poorly for, media works really poorly for that same reason.
And so you say media businesses should have an M&A strategy. Is that strategy think about the relevant data or SaaS company in your space and think about selling to them, or is it
very hard? Well, the issue is, certainly if you're building a media business, could you sell to a SaaS business? Absolutely. We did it very effectively. One of the things that I think is also difficult about media businesses is that once you lose the founders and once you lose a couple of the core voices, you oftentimes lose. And this is the reason a lot of these exits to, these product companies, whether it's JP Morgan has bought a media company, or we've seen with the Hustle sold to HubSpot, a lot of the principals leave, and effectively those voices go away. That's the biggest issue you see in non-media buyers buying a media company. And so, ultimately the playbook that I would have if I were a SaaS buyer is I would want to buy a media company, but I would want to have the media principals stay in the business and incented to grow it, because I think you need that voice. And so, it has been really successful for us, but a lot of it's because I've driven the success of our media business. I'm the primary voice in our media business. And I've set the tone for what our media business is about at FreightWaves. And so it makes it incredibly difficult for someone else to take that. Frankly, one of the reasons we split the businesses is we realized, you think about venture capital, VCs are in a business really at 12 years is sort of the maximum length that an early stage VC will stay in a business. Now, they can get recapped and bought out over time. So our institutional round, our oldest investors in it for 7 years, we're sort of a middle-aged company in terms of a VC portfolio. There is an event, a recapitalization that's inevitable, and we're trying to maximize value. And one of the issues you have with FreightWaves is that I'm largely identified with the company. I am the face of the company. We have this very successful SaaS platform in the background that is not dependent. It's the other thing about media businesses, which I think it make it very difficult for investors to underwrite, is you are underwriting the human element. There's a risk of me as a personality that an investor can't put into a spreadsheet. Like, it's the same thing with athletes. Is there is a risk with an athlete? Do they, when you back an athlete, do they have, are they healthy? Do they have issues? Do they have interpersonal demons that all of a sudden appear? Now, I'd like to think I don't have a ton of interpersonal demons that will come out at some point, but I'm still a risk that a private equity fund or a venture fund would have to underwrite. And so when you get into media businesses that are largely driven by humans, it's very different than a SaaS business, which is largely driven by math.
Yeah. I'm curious what you think of this analogy. Is it fair to say that something like Industry Dive is almost like the Craigslist? And I say this as a compliment in the sense that it had, Craigslist had all these different categories, and then, other businesses took different parts of those categories, like Airbnb took listings and then went so much deeper and built a massive business. And for example, there might have been like a logistics dive or supply chain dive or something. You took that category and almost made a Industry Dive within, just logistics or supply chain, where you now cover all these subcategories in your omni-channel, and you built a data business on top of it. Do you think that analogy holds?
Not really. I mean, I think the better sort of analogy for Industry Dive is more like a morning brew type business. I mean, ultimately, Industry Dive at its core function is a newsletter business. That's where the predominance of what people identify with Industry Dive. And what they've done is they sort of templated a very easy format to copy across a lot of verticals. The way they approach media is very different than the way we approach media. Like, we go deep. Like, we have the expensive work of actually doing a ton of original reporting, breaking news, trying to be the first to cover a topic, provide a lot of intelligent insights into a vertical. Whereas Industry Dive's model is to basically provide a summary that someone, a busy executive that's in an industry, can read and consume in potentially a couple minutes and be caught up with all the major stories of the day. That model is frankly easier and cheaper to execute than a deep sort of core journalism model. It doesn't mean it's wrong. And frankly, from a financial standpoint, Industry Dive's business model is more scalable. Frankly, it's more venture backable from a scale model because it's a templated business that you can scale between multiple, hundreds of verticals potentially. And that's why, it fetched a very high valuation by Informa when it was originally purchased, because it is a model that could scale between potentially hundreds of verticals. Our model is quite different. Our model fits more of a traditional media journalism model, where we know a topic very deeply, and we're providing a lot of sort of deep level of context about that topic, but also individual sort of products, which include podcasts and newsletters and stuff. But frankly, I say this often, is that, like, if I'm an aspiring entrepreneur, you don't have to go create original content. Frankly, there are entrepreneurs in supply chain that take our content and repurpose it in a very easy way to digest it. These are very small businesses with 2 or 3 people, and frankly, have been very successful doing so. They can find advertising against it. There are media executives that would say that's not fair. You're ripping off our content. I'm not one of those that believes that. Frankly, I admire them for doing that kind of effort, because what I do is a lot of very expensive and hard work, and they're creating a derivative product that they benefit off of it. It's not a zero-sum game. Some executives will treat it as a zero-sum game. I don't think of it as that way. But it is interesting how those models can scale quicker and faster and easier and cheaper than, frankly, what we do.
Yeah, but it's very interesting. And so the model that you've done, going very deep, omni-channel, et cetera, as you described, but could you imagine, I'm just looking at Industry Dive right now, automotive, agriculture, banking, biopharma, like a FreightWaves for every kind of, every sector, basically? Like, is the model...
You need big sectors. Could you take our model and replicate it in every sector? Potentially, but the scale of what you would achieve there would be quite different. You could do it in construction and building. You could do it in farming and ag. And there's a number of media companies that serve these, because these are big industries where you can have 20, 30 reporters reporting on different topics in this industry. The model works really well when you sort of diversify outside one core industry. And we see it. I mean, construction, there's a number of construction media companies that are very successful. There's a number of ag companies that are very successful. And it's also very hard for those ag and construction media companies, to go into topics that is not in construction or ag, because their team is built to sort of serve these audiences. And you don't typically see a lot of diversity of content in these very specific media verticals. What you do see those companies do, very similar to what we've done at FreightWaves, is they go out and create other types of products that serve that same audience. And that's probably the best return on investment, because it's much harder to go build up a media. Let's say that a construction media business wanted to move into supply chain or freight. To really compete against us and to provide deep level of information and become relevant in the sort of supply chain sphere, that would take an enormous amount of budget to hire reporters and really go out and execute that. We're already there. The market does not suggest that it's big enough to have multiple players of scale. Therefore, they're better off sort of staying in their world. Just like if I tried to enter the construction reporting industry, it would take an enormous amount of resources to go build that. Whereas versus me investing in my own sort of vehicle and vertical,
Right.
and putting stuff together. Industry dives model is different. It works really well with what you've described, going after multiple verticals. It's really hard to replicate what we do in different verticals.
Right. You'd have to spend a lot. So the reason why someone wouldn't want to do it in your industry is because you're already there. And my assumption is that in other industries, there aren't businesses who are as deep or as advanced as what you've done in supply chain, like in construction, for example. And so someone who has the money to invest could co-found or hire a joint venture with the right reporters or right expertise, provide the capital and the media expertise. And I'm curious, like if there was a clone of you, for example, who wasn't working on FreightWaves but had the same expertise, could you almost have like an incubator? Say, hey, we're gonna do a FreightWaves for construction, find the right team, put them together for ag, etc. Or is it actually there is a FreightWaves for every industry already? And
No, I mean, there's certainly vertical media. I mean, construction has a vertical media business. Zonda is sort of the vertical media provider in the construction industry. There's a couple others that are there. So it's not to say that these don't exist. And like there were supply chain media businesses before we came along. It wasn't as if we were the first and only to do this. We did it different. We focused on the part of the market that was sort of high cadence, high frequency. A lot of the big issues in media is that a lot of these businesses came from print cycles, where the journalists only sort of understand putting stuff together and having it published, maybe write an article and it's published a month later. That's a very different sort of cadence than running a breaking news business that provides real-time information. So you certainly could do that in other industries. You would want a larger degree of volatility. You would want a lot of things happening, whether it's regulatory changes. You want a big audience and a big enough market that's not sleepy and sort of stagnant. Logistics is an enormously dynamic industry with a lot of volatility. Our model works really well here. It would be very difficult to take an industry that's sort of sleepy and boring and isn't a lot of changes in it, whether it's technology changes or regulatory changes or economic changes. It'd be difficult to pull off what we do and sort of replicate that in a sort of stagnant industry. It just would, because the model doesn't work well. Our model works really well, where you're on breaking news, a lot of stuff's happening, there's a lot of participants, and the market is incredibly volatile, whether it's price changes, economic changes, technology influxes, a lot of regulatory conversation. The advantage we have in supply chain is so big, and there's so many topics that are constantly happening that it makes sense. I own another media business that I've talked about that is involved in the aviation and marine business. Now, I could pull off, and I plan to, now we've spun off the FreightWaves media business, plan to develop content, B2B content in aviation. It is a very large industry, massively fragmented, going through big technology changes. Big regulatory issues are facing it. It's an inflection point in terms of a lot of new tech and investment is going to completely change the way the airline industry and aviation industry works over the next couple of decades. It has an enormous amount of sort of stories that should be told. I could execute a FreightWaves of aviation, and I plan on doing that. I own another part of that business is involved in recreation marine, which is building boats. It's a harder industry to think about a B2B business. It's not to say that there isn't B2B interest there. It's just, it's a different kind of industry than, say, the aviation industry, which has a lot more volatility.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Getting closer a bit to my world, I'm curious how you would think about AI in that same, our friends at Blockworks have built this great vertical media business for crypto, omni-channel, et cetera. And I'm curious if there's a similar opportunity to do so in AI, or if that's too abstract, or how do you think about that?
No, I think it's actually. I mean, look, I think crypto has volatility. One of the things that has enabled FreightWaves to be successful, but also very much like the crypto industry, is um, crypto is an incredibly volatile industry. It's a very fragmented industry. It's a frontier industry going through an enormous amount of changes, whether it's regulatory stories, new participants, the boom and bust cycle of individual businesses. It is a captivating concept in many ways. And so it naturally lends itself to a freightway style media business. You can build what we've built into crypto because it has all the things that you would want as a formula. In AI, I think also you've got it's a frontier industry. It's going through an enormous amount of changes. There's a lot of personalities to it. There's a lot of big companies are interested in it, but nobody really knows what to do with it just yet, or how it will work, or what it all means. And it captivates a broader public. So I think AI would be an incredibly easy industry to sort of start a media business. And so, from my standpoint, that's absolutely something interesting. And if I knew something about pharmaceuticals or biotech, I could make the same arguments. So there are industries. I'm not to suggest that freightways and supply chain is the only industry. Far from it. I'm just suggesting that you have to pick your industries that you're going to sort of attack these issues in and sort of to build a business.
And that segues to what I'm up to now, which I briefly shared at the dinner we were at a bit ago, but I'll go into more detail because I'm curious for your advice. It's basically I've looked at the Lenny Rachitskis and Harry Stebbings of the world, who've built these sort of vertical media businesses, podcast newsletters for different positions in tech, whether it's product managers with Lenny or venture capitalists with Harry, and there are a few people who are more sector specific. And I said, hey, this seems like the future. Like, not to rag on tech journalists, but tech journalism has not been great in
No.
tech, and there's because most of the people who could write about it are doing it.
Tech journalism is horrible. Like it's and I think most of journalism, Wired magazine. So I don't know how old you are, but I'm 44. Wired magazine in the 90s was like it was 300 pages. It was beautiful. And it felt like the leading edge. And then TechCrunch sort of took the podium away, if you will, from Wired. And with the exception of the information, and the information is sort of covering the business stories, the back end of these businesses, which is incredibly great journalism. But they're also talking about the problems with these businesses. It's written for people like you and I that are interested in sort of these businesses, the founders and the valuation, what's happened in venture capital. It's not written for the broader public about what the technology can do. But I remember growing up reading Popular Science and Popular Mechanics and Wired, and they sort of made technology as sort of the great frontier, sort of an
Yeah,
unknown industry. And we've lost that. I mean, a lot of the tech journalism is in gotcha, and it's really sort of sold out to a lot of the cultural war
yeah,
issues. And it just feels like that has become that isn't what I want to consume necessarily.
yeah.
It's just a very different type of journalism.
Totally. And so, yeah, we've identified as like, I think one of the reasons why the Lennys and the Harrys do well is they help people get better at their job, basically. And so we started with just podcasts. We're at 14 podcasts now, and we cover sectors, we cover different positions. Like we have an HR podcast, a CFO podcast, and we also just partner with big, people who have big Substacks, and we make podcasts for them. But we want to start being omni-channel. We want to cover the tech industry, but for people who are trying to get better at their jobs, basically. So more of like trade media, although the broader journalism opportunity for the broader public is a great opportunity. I'm not a journalist. I'm someone who's worked in venture capital and startups for the last, decade plus. And I'm thinking, the critique of what I'm doing is, hey, Erik, why don't you just go really deep on AI? Go really deep on one category and keep going. But it's kind of not my personality for whatever reason. And I am going to go do stuff on AI as like our first experiment across our for newsletter or lists or conference. Like I'll do it within one category to test out these new formats. But I'm trying to figure out, basically, given what I kind of want to do, which is create these vertical media platforms within tech. Sort of the criteria is like, would a venture capitalist invest in it? What's the best business model for me to do? And I kind of identified two potential different businesses. One is this just vertical media, like what Lenny and Harry do, but in many different positions and sectors. And the second is kind of this data business, almost like a Tegas. I'm not sure if you're familiar. For the audience, they record expert calls and then sell the transcripts to investors and other players who are looking to diligence these companies and diligence these trends. And I'm wondering if our podcasts or the media that we build can almost be a freemium, a way to get paid to profitably build this like research company or insights company that we then get all these diligence on these companies, on these trends, on these people, products. Like we might have a podcast called Customer References, for example, where we go deep on different products, hear what customers think about them, release some of it publicly and some of it behind a paywall, as an example. And so I'm curious what advice you might give for me, or how you might think about it if you were me.
I mean, I would say, I think you got to pick a lane. You're either going to go wide or you're going to go deep.
Yeah.
If you're going to go wide, you're going to be more like Industry Dive in the sense that you've got a lot of very specific verticals, but you're not the first call when there's a story. You're not the first place that somebody goes to read deep insights, because you have a finite number of resources to do that at scale. Because at some point, like even an Industry Dives model is, if they double the size of the editorial staff covering a topic. I think they have 3 people in supply chain dive, I think is the number. That may be up to 4, but there's a finite amount that they could throw into that group to make that P&L work for that particular vertical. Whereas, and so that's difficult when there's a big story that's sort of emerging. They just don't have enough resources to sort of attack all these various stories. I have a much deeper bench to sort of go after the bigger stories. And so going deep, I think, works really well for us. I don't think I could go very wide without an enormous amount of capital to sort of deploy it into all of these different verticals. And so I think for you is figuring out, do I want to be the source for AI intelligence and what's happening in the AI industry and be on the frontier of that, and covering AI in healthcare and AI in supply chain? We're all about AI. Everything we do is AI, but it's in these individual verticals, and go deep inside of AI and how it's going to impact these verticals. I think you could execute that well, but I think I would be reluctant to sort of want to go so wide, because then you also get into this advertising problem. The sponsor problem is, it's very, like, if you look at Industry Dives advertisers, they're big tech companies typically. They're not as deep, like they don't have as many deep relationships, even in supply chain, which they have a vertical. We don't tend to share as many advertisers as you would think. We may cover the same topics, but ours is very deep industry. They tend to go much more broader, sort of big ticket tech companies that are trying to sell, maybe it's a Salesforce trying to sell into a tech vertical, or an IBM. They're less likely to pick up our advertisers because they're, again, much more of a shotgun approach. And I think for you, it's figuring out, do you want to go deep or wide? I think you have to pick a lane.
Yeah. And maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, TechCrunch could have just covered all of tech, but now tech is too big that you have.
They don't even do a good job covering it now. I mean, unless it's right out of Silicon Valley. And it used to be fun. I mean, they used to do the funding announcements. They were like, that's where I haven't read TechCrunch in some time. I mean, occasionally a story is interesting, but like most of what's happened is it's been watered down. There's no depth in their reporting, it feels like.
Totally. That's helpful. And say more about how you think about sort of journalists, or the intersection of, or like the different tensions between like journalism and like research, and why it's important to break a story. Let's say I want to go deep on AI. I want to help investors make smarter decisions about, or companies make smarter decisions about where to allocate capital and opportunities, and how they should think about disruptions in their business. Is a journalist the right person to do that, or is that like an analyst, or how do you think about sort of this
I mean,
stuff?
I think journalists can be analysts and analysts can be journalists. I don't know that I mean, you have somebody with a background. I mean, frankly, it's really how much are they getting paid? That's really the difference between an analyst and journalist is usually in salary. Someone who comes from an editorial background is likely getting paid less than an analyst background, just by nature of the types of people who are analysts versus journalists. We've seen journalists that have left FreightWaves that have gone on to be analysts and have been able to increase their compensation in doing so.
But you're
Because
saying
they've
scoops are important, basically, is what you're saying.
I'm sorry?
Like, scoops are important. Like when you said
They're
get a
incredibly important because this is how you create a relationship with the reader. This is how you define that you are not. If a story breaks, and let's say it's a big enough story where there's going to be a lot of sort of interest among the public, and your public could be, in my world, it's supply chain public. It could be the broader public. There's always going to be a source for information for that typically, and until it gets distributed. At some point, if it's a big enough story, every media company in the country is going to be trying to, that's interested in the topics and try to recover it. You want to be the primary source, and the reason is, from an SEO standpoint, it's sort of obvious, is you get all sort of first references, but also it helps you define your brand. You create a memory, an impression in the mind of someone, and you become sort of the definitive source in that story. So I think breaking news is really important in a model where you're deep. It isn't important in that wide distributed model that we talked about. In a templated model like Industry Dive, you don't need to be the one breaking news because you're effectively recreating content that's easy to digest. But breaking news is very expensive. You need to have people who are respected in the industry that are able to get the stories. But it's important from an audience standpoint because it helps create your reputation. Like when you're moving financial markets, and we've done this at FreightWaves, you are in many ways influencing not just the way people think about topics, but an entire industry. You're shaping the way an industry operates. And I think that is where, to me, that's where the magic of media really comes in, is that you're actually to have a pretty broad influence on an issue or a topic.
Right. And so, yeah, you want the sweet spot of people come to you because they know that you'll have the most up-to-date news, or a story will be broken on your, but you also have the best perspective on it. And
you're providing context to it. And usually if you're the one breaking news, that it becomes self-reinforcing. I mean, it's a flywheel, because the next time there's a topic, people will come to you to see if you've reported on it because they expect you to, right? Like that expectation exists for the consumer. Where if there's a topic and you've been the one that's been breaking the news, and all of a sudden there's also a level of credibility. If you're on a topic and you're not reporting on something that's happening, we had a story this past summer with Yellow, a big trucking company that had filed bankruptcy. It was a huge story for the broader public, but it was also something that we were on top of. And there was a couple of times that we didn't report something, and there was a lot of questions about whether the other people that did report it were credible because we hadn't reported it. There's a comment made to me by an executive is that Gartner actually said something. The quote was, "It's not real until it's in FreightWaves." So the Gartner, the big tech analyst publication, was their supply chain practice, and made the comment, "Hey, these stories aren't real until they're in FreightWaves." Like, we're the ones that actually sort of create a level of credibility to the story. And I think that's important to create a brand.
Yeah. And so the risk to something like an Industry Dive is that they go so wide, and the media sort of market matures where there does become a much deeper player in every space. And then it's like, why do you go to the Industry Dive if they're like the second best in every category? Because there's a FreightWaves who's only focused on one category across everything.
Yeah, but again, I think it comes. I mean, look, Industry Dive's model of creating easy to consume content, I think, like I said, it's more scalable than a FreightWaves is. From a financial standpoint, it provides an enormous amount of flexibility because you can launch a new vertical in days. You can hire 3 reporters and you're off on your way. I mean, you certainly could backfill and continue to scale up that group if you found success in it. But I just think that, look, from a financial standpoint, it's probably a more effective way to scale a media business than what we've done. It's cheaper, frankly. But again, I think it's two different ways to sort of approach it. You do have a risk of someone sort of taking. I mean, Supply Chain Dive, I think, came after FreightWaves, and they were still success. They're still successful, but we don't consider them a true editorial competitor.
Right. And you said the advertisers are different. Like your advertisers are looking to go really deep across the subsector, and their advertisers might just trying to go wide, like HR professionals.
They're really good for the busy executives. Like if you're a busy executive and you need, or let's say that, because most of their content is built for tech buyers and decision makers. If you're involved in, say, waste or in the supply chain industry, and you're a busy executive and you don't have time to read long form articles, but you want a summary of something, you hit it. It's the same way Morning Brew has been successful. I mean, Morning Brew has taken other articles written by Bloomberg, the Journal, maybe even Business Insider, its parent company, and created a way that it's easy to digest. I know sort of the 3 or 5 most important things to know today. And I don't have to know all the sort of deep depth that I would know. That's effectively industry dives model.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's brainstorm with the last remaining 5 minutes. Let's quickly brainstorm. Let's say, hey, I was going all in on AI, and I was asking for advice of, hey, do I build a digital website, that tries to, with some journalists, tries to scoop latest funding rounds and what's happening, to build some newsletters, like you mentioned, AI healthcare, like different category podcasts alongside. Like, what advice would you have for me? Like, I know I want to go deep on AI. What should I do?
How big is your budget?
Let's say it's $1 million.
I mean, newsletters are the easiest. They're the fastest to monetize. They're the easiest because you have a direct feedback of the audience. You see the traffic immediately. Newsletters are the actually easiest to monetize. So what I would do is throw up a WordPress instance with some newsletters attached to it. And I would start writing about AI and built my own sort of, corner around the AI industry, and try to find a couple of journalists that could create, newsletter content, could publish articles to the website, perhaps host a podcast, and really try to focus on, hey, we are the leading source of AI information. And then what I would do is, once I've sort of built the core thesis around AI, then I would go look at individual verticals that my audience that has big enough audiences where AI is going to influence it. Obviously, media is an obvious vertical. Like, we're all in the media business trying to figure out, is AI a good thing, bad thing? Is this the end for real journalism or the beginning of a new generation? I think all of us have these questions. We all have theories. But you could also go into healthcare and supply chain. I mean, you could build an AI very specific, but I think what you're wanting to do, or what I would do, is be very specific to the audience so they understood that this is an AI publication covering healthcare or supply chain, but your AI, because then in many ways you're covering the AI topic that we are never going to be able to cover as well. And even in the mind of a consumer of it, unless I have AI reporters that are able to sort of really dive into how AI works and what it does, I'm never going to be able to compete against that. So a decision maker in an AI decision, if they trust that you are the experts of AI, then they're going to put a lot more credibility in your recommendations than mine, because I'm just a generalist reporting on supply chain topics where you are the experts.
Yeah. It's fascinating. One thing that made me think about is I've had this a little bit of different model to date, where instead of hiring people to create content, I kind of joint venture with them. Basically, a lot of the hosts of our podcast have other full-time jobs and they just want to host a podcast. And I basically 50-50 profit split with them. And so that probably doesn't work as much for newsletters because it takes more time and it's also less to do there. But it's just an interesting thing to think about, where, yeah, I'm going to move from having these sort of like part-time, revenue split relationships to hiring upfront, or full-time salaried writers and journalists. And there's just kind of different incentives there when one does that. But I'm curious what you think of that model.
Yeah, I mean, look, the influencer or the sort of contributor model, I think, works well. It gives people a level of independence, and that the only issue that I would sort of see is that if someone is truly independent, they may say at some point, "Hey, I have an audience. I don't need you," and then they go and create their own sort of. And this is true, really, of even when you hire them as employees. Like one of the biggest issues when we've had contractors come in is we give them the platform to start and they start to get some traction and sort of goes to their head and they sort of think, oh, I can do this on my own. I don't need you. They don't realize all the work on the back end. They don't appreciate the production that you're doing, sort of production resources. They don't appreciate the marketing of their content because effectively you're doing a lot of the marketing that they would have to do. If you have ad ops, they don't appreciate any of that, and they aspire to do their own thing. I've seen this on multiple occasions, and the problem is that for them, they don't realize that a lot of that stuff that goes into it because they don't see it, and they don't put any value on it. They just see that they're paying you half the revenue and think, I can make that all myself. That's the biggest issue with independent contributors is like they do have an independent streak for a reason. And at some point, if they build up enough success, they can feel like they can do it on their own.
Yeah.
It's not an impossible model, but
Right.
the only issue that you got is if the person's hosting a podcast or writing a newsletter, the issue that you end up with is at some point, if it becomes good enough and they built up a strong enough voice, that they may start asking how much value do you create for them?
Exactly.
And I think that's the biggest risk because all of a sudden, let's say you have a newsletter that does $1 million because this one contributor is amazing. You're taking half of that. Well, all of a sudden they go away. That $500,000 is at risk. And so that's the only problem with the independent contributor model. It's a great way, an efficient way to build a business. The only problem is you're one decision away, the contributor's decision away from wanting the level of independence that because at some point they start looking at you as a tax.
Yeah, and it's well said. And another downside is it's harder to build a centralized brand. Like if we have all these decentralized, influencers, it's hard to build up the Turpentine brand in the same way.
I think you see it in sort of broader consumer media. Sports media has done it successfully.
Right.
There are ways to create an independent voice, but a platform. It's just not something I've had success with so far. And like I said, when we do with independent contributors, we've had a lot of success in aviation having independent contributors because these are like commercial pilots. They're flying for JetBlue or American, or they're flight instructors, and there just isn't another place for them to really get the level of. But they don't aspire to be a contributor. They are their independent voice. They aspire to have a voice heard. And that works really well if they have an existing job and career. And this is something they do as a hobby, as a way to have a voice. But it's not an aspirational thing.
Totally.
I think the entrepreneurs are the ones that are more challenging.
Yeah. And last question, if I told you I had a $5 million or $10 million budget, would you then say, hey, go create a digital website and hire a bunch of reporters or how would your answer change?
Yeah, look, if you had 5 million or 10 million, I don't know that my answer would change. I mean, I would go.
Newsletters first.
I would do exactly what I said before. It doesn't matter whether, the amount of money you pour on something is just a matter of scale and how fast you can. A lot of it's speed. Yep. More money means I can get there faster. I can probably still get there. It's just going to take a lot longer if I have less money. But the reality of this is I think what I would do is go hire some reporters, develop some newsletters, build a website, build a podcast around it. But I would decide what I wanted to be. And I would think for you saying, I'm going to be AI, if that's where you're ultimately headed, is, hey, we're going to be the source of AI information. No one's going to beat us at this topic. Yeah. And I think if you own that and you sort of carve out your world, I think you stand the chance to build a very successful media business.
Yeah, and the going wide that's the industry dive model, and you just have to have a template that can work, but risk being.
It's not. Look, like I said, I think from a financial and ROI basis, it's a more attractive outcome. Probably better for an exit, frankly, because it's a platform that isn't as dependent. I can't name a single reporter that does this industry dive topic, including the supply chain reporters. I bet if you ask supply chain people, they could probably name 4 or 5 FreightWaves folks. So it's just a different model. And like I said, it's probably better positioned for exit than FreightWaves is, frankly, because it is a platform that you can scale between verticals. I think it just depends on what you're trying to optimize for.
Yeah. Well, we're at time, so I want to be mindful. Craig, this has been a masterclass in building a media company. Really grateful that you share your wisdom with us and our listeners. You've pioneered this model of vertical media, going super deep, partnering, being synergistic with a data and SaaS business. And I think a lot of people like me, like Workweek, like others have watched and said, hey, Blockworks, et cetera. So thank you for being a pioneer and sharing your learning lessons with us.
I appreciate it, Erik. Thanks for your time.